The sky over Los Angeles began to darken at 3 in the afternoon, a dramatic change that Harrison Ford observed with growing concern from the cockpit of his Cessna Citation CJ-3. At 82 years old, Ford had already faced more dangerous situations in the air than most professional pilots, but something about this day seemed different. The air had a heavy, electric quality, as if the very atmosphere was charged with malevolent energy. Santa Monica Tower, this is November 777 Hotel Foxtrot, requesting route change due to deteriorating weather conditions. Ford spoke into the radio, his voice carrying decades of aviation experience. The response came immediately, clear and professional. Hotel Foxtrot, Santa Monica Tower, approved route change to heading 090, maintain altitude 15,000 feet. We have reports of severe turbulence east of your position. Ford adjusted the heading and checked his instruments. The Citation was performing perfectly, as always. It was an aircraft he knew intimately, every sound, every vibration. He had bought this specific plane after his accident with the Ryan PT-22 in 2015, when he nearly died making a forced landing at Penmar Golf Course. Since then, he had been extremely cautious, but had never stopped flying. Flying was his passion, his escape, his way of finding peace away from Hollywood's spotlight. But today, as he looked at the dark clouds forming rapidly on the horizon, Ford felt an unease he couldn't explain. The clouds weren't normal. They were too high, too dark, and moving in a way that defied meteorological logic. They seemed to be forming in layers, creating a solid wall of darkness that extended from ground level to altitudes he had never seen clouds reach. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself, checking the weather radar again. The screen showed a storm mass that hadn't been there 15 minutes ago. It was as if it had materialized from nothing, a massive cyclonic formation extending for hundreds of nautical miles. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at 15,500 feet. The aircraft began to vibrate, a subtle vibration that Ford felt through the controls before he could even see it visually. He reduced power slightly and checked all engine indicators. Everything seemed normal, but the vibration continued, growing in intensity. "Hotel Foxtrot, Santa Monica Tower, we're receiving strange readings from your transponder. Confirm your position and altitude." Ford looked at the transponder. The screen was blinking intermittently, showing inconsistent readings. "Santa Monica Tower, transponder showing intermittent failure. My position is approximately 30 miles southwest of LAX, maintaining 15,500. Negative, Hotel Foxtrot. We cannot get visual or radar confirmation. Repeat your position." A chill ran down Ford's spine. In all his years of flying, he had never lost complete contact with air traffic control over Los Angeles. This was one of the most monitored areas of American airspace. "Santa Monica Tower, November 777 Hotel. Foxtrot, I'm not copying adequately. Please repeat." Silence. Ford adjusted the radio, checked all frequencies, tried contact with LAX, Burbank, Long Beach. Nothing. Just static. It was at that moment the clouds engulfed him. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. 1 second Ford was flying in relatively clear sky. The next he was completely enveloped by dense, suffocating darkness. It wasn't like entering a normal cloud. It was as if the world had simply disappeared. The temperature plummeted immediately, and Ford could see his own breath condensing in the cold cockpit air, despite the heating system working perfectly. The aircraft began to be shaken violently. It wasn't common turbulence. These were brutal shocks, as if giant hands were grabbing the aircraft and shaking it like a toy. Ford gripped the controls firmly, fighting to keep the aircraft level, but it was like trying to control a leaf in a hurricane. "Mayday, mayday, mayday!" Ford shouted into the radio. "November 777 Hotel, Foxtrot in emergency. Extreme turbulence, losing aircraft control." Only static responded. The instruments began to go crazy. The altimeter spun uncontrollably, showing first 20,000 feet, then 5,000, then back to 15,000 in seconds. The airspeed indicator oscillated between 80 knots and 300. The compass spun like a mad top, and the artificial horizon showed an impossible inclination that didn't correspond to what Ford felt in the aircraft. Lightning cut through the darkness beside the right window, so close that Ford could feel the heat through the glass. The thunder that followed wasn't a sound. It was a physical force that went through his body, making his bones vibrate. More lightning began to flash around the aircraft, creating a demented strobe light that transformed the cockpit interior into a disco from hell. "What's happening?" Ford screamed to no one, his voice being swallowed by the deafening roar of wind and thunder. The plane was being thrown up and down with a violence that defied any experience he had ever had. In his worst nightmares about flying, he had never imagined anything like this. Aircraft control was becoming impossible. When Ford pulled the stick to climb, the plane dove. When he pushed down, the aircraft climbed vertiginously. It was as if the laws of physics had been suspended, as if he were flying through a world where cause and effect no longer had meaning. And then came the fire. It wasn't a normal engine fire. These were blue and white flames that licked the windshield, flames that seemed to dance independently of the wind, flames that weren't burning anything, but simply existed, as if they were made of pure light instead of combustion. "No, no, no!" Ford roared, his voice breaking with terror. "This can't be happening!" He tried every emergency procedure he knew, cut fuel to the engines, tried to restart electrical systems, checked circuit breakers. Nothing worked. In fact, his actions seemed to have no effect on the aircraft whatsoever. It was as if he was no longer flying a real airplane, but rather a shadow of an airplane, a ghost of metal and fiberglass that responded only to the supernatural forces surrounding it. The altimeter now showed an impossible reading, minus 2,000 feet. Ford was flying below sea level according to the instruments, but this was physically impossible over Los Angeles. "Mayday! Mayday! Can anyone hear me?" He shouted into the radio, his voice hoarse and desperate. "November 777 Hotel. Foxtrot in extreme emergency. I'm losing all systems." The radio silence was more terrifying than any storm. It was the silence of death, the silence of absolute void. Ford began to hyperventilate. His lungs couldn't process the thin cockpit air, despite being at pressurized altitude. His vision began to darken at the edges, and he realized he was entering total panic. In all his movies as Indiana Jones and Han Solo, he had faced impossible situations with calm and determination. But this was real. This was death approaching, and he was completely powerless. "I'm going to die," he whispered, then repeated louder, "I'm going to die here." The aircraft made a violent lateral movement, as if it had been hit by a giant hammer. Ford was thrown against the cockpit door, and when he managed to recover, he saw that the windshield was beginning to crack. Fine lines appeared in the glass, spreading like spiderwebs. "I can't die like this," he screamed hysterically. "I can't. I have family. I have work to do." His voice was breaking, tears running down his face. The man who had played some of the most courageous heroes in cinema was completely shattered, reduced to a terrified human being facing his own mortality. "Someone help me, please. Someone." It was then that the voice spoke. "Scared, Ford." Ford stopped screaming instantly. The voice had cut through the storm's roar like a knife through silk. It was clear, calm, with a slight Midwestern American accent and a quality that suggested decades of experience and absolute authority. Ford slowly turned his head to the right, and his heart stopped. In the co-pilot seat, where seconds before there had been no one, sat a young man, probably in his late 20s. He wore a World War II pilot uniform, brown leather jacket with US Army Air Force's patches, aviator goggles, and a flight cap slightly tilted. His eyes were blue and penetrating, and there was a sardonic smile on his lips. "Scared, Ford?" the man repeated, his voice carrying a note of amused sarcasm. Ford opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water. Finally, he managed to form words. Who are you? How did you... Aren't you Han Solo?" the ghost pilot asked, completely ignoring Ford's questions. "Or Indiana Jones? Sorry, but I don't understand all this hysteria. Seriously." I... Ford stammered, looking alternately at the stranger and at the aircraft's crazed controls. "Am I dead? Is that it? Are you an angel of death?" The young pilot laughed, a genuine warm laugh that somehow managed to be heard above the storm's roar. "Angel of death?" he repeated, still laughing. "Man, that's a new one. No, Ford, you're not dead. Yet. But if you keep up all this hysteria, you will die, and pretty ugly too." "Who the hell are you?" Ford shouted, his voice oscillating between terror and anger. "How did you get into my plane? What's happening?" The pilot extended his hand naturally, as if they were meeting at a Beverly Hills cocktail party, instead of being in an out-of-control aircraft in the middle of a supernatural storm. "Major Richard Ira Bong, U.S. Army Air Forces. 40 confirmed kills in the Pacific Theater. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Jones, or should I say Mr. Solo? Ford looked at the extended hand with total incredulity. You're kidding me? We're crashing and you're making social introductions? Actually, Bong said calmly, checking the watch on his wrist. We're not crashing, we're flying in circles at about 12,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean. And if you stop screaming like a little girl and start paying attention, I can help you get out of this. This is impossible, Ford muttered, looking at the instruments that continued to show impossible readings. You can't be here. You don't exist. I'm hallucinating. Lack of oxygen. This is hypoxia. Richard Ira Bong, the pilot repeated patiently. Born September 24, 1920, in Poplar, Wisconsin. Died August 6, 1945, testing the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star in Burbank, California. 40 confirmed aerial victories flying the P-38 Lightning. America's ace of aces. Ford stared at him. There was something about the way the man spoke, the precision of the details, the complete naturalness of his presence, that made it impossible to dismiss as hallucination. You've been dead for almost 80 years, Ford whispered. Correct, Bong nodded. But death is a relative concept when it comes to pilots, especially pilots who die doing what they love. Another lightning bolt cut through the air beside the plane, followed by thunder that made the entire fuselage vibrate. Ford instinctively flinched, but Bong didn't even blink. P-51 Mustang, Bong said casually, as if commenting on the weather. I flew some of those too, though I preferred the Lightning. But let me tell you about the first time I flew through a storm over the South Pacific. I don't want to hear your war stories, Ford exploded. I want to know how to get out of here alive. Bong sighed and leaned back in the co-pilot's seat, completely relaxed while the aircraft was being violently shaken. You know what your problem is, Ford, he said, his voice maintaining that irritating calm. You've spent so much time playing heroes that you forgot how to be one. In the movies, there's always a script, always a stunt double, always a second take if something goes wrong. This isn't cinema, Ford shouted. This is real. Exactly, Bong agreed. It's real. And in the real world, pilots don't scream like babies when things get bad. In the real world, pilots assess the situation, make adjustments, and fly the damn aircraft. The controls don't work, Ford roared, shaking the stick violently. Nothing works. Of course they work, Bong said calmly. You're just trying to fly against the storm instead of with it. That doesn't make sense. Bong leaned forward and placed his hands over Ford's controls. The instant his fingers touched the stick, Ford felt an immediate change. The aircraft didn't stop being shaken, but somehow the controls began to respond again. See? Bong said, moving the stick smoothly. Don't fight the currents. Fly with them. Use the storm's energy instead of trying to beat it. Ford felt the aircraft respond, and for the first time in 20 minutes, he had the sensation that he was actually piloting again, not just being a passive victim of natural forces. How do you... 44 months of aerial combat, Bong interrupted. I flew through typhoons over Rabaul that made this little storm look like a summer breeze, faced Japanese Zeros in formations that blocked out the sun, saw things that would make your action movies look like cartoons. He kept his hands over Ford's controls, gently guiding the movements. First lesson of aerial combat. Panic kills. Always. Panicked pilots make erratic movements, lose spatial orientation, and become easy targets. But this isn't aerial combat, Ford protested, though his voice was already calmer now that he felt some control over the aircraft. Every emergency situation in the air is combat, Bong replied. You're fighting against the forces of nature, against the very air that sustains you. And like in any combat, those who keep calm live, those who panic die. Ford breathed deeply, trying to calm himself. The plane was still being shaken, but now he had the feeling he was actually in control. Okay, he said, his voice firmer. What do we do now? First, Bong said, you're going to tell me exactly where you were going and where you came from. Then, we'll figure out where we really are. I was flying from Santa Monica to Jackson Hole, Ford explained. Routine trip, I've done it hundreds of times. Jackson Hole, Wyoming? Bong asked. What for? I have a house there. I wanted to spend a few days away from Los Angeles, from the media. The famous Harrison Ford needs time away from the paparazzi, Bong said with sarcasm. How rough. Ford looked at him with irritation. Listen, I don't need your sarcastic attitude. Actually, you do, Bong interrupted him, because this sarcastic attitude comes from someone who spent 4 years being shot at by some of the world's best pilots, someone who saw friends get shot down in flames over the Pacific, someone who knows what real fear is. He stopped talking for a moment, his eyes focusing on something beyond the storm. You want to know about fear? Bong continued, his voice becoming more serious. Fear is being alone in a P-38 over Rabaul, surrounded by 12 Zeros with ammunition running out and fuel in the red. Fear is watching your wingman get shot down and not being able to do anything to save him. Fear is knowing that every mission could be your last and still getting in the plane every morning. Ford fell silent, beginning to understand that he was dealing with something far beyond his comprehension. So, excuse me if I don't have much sympathy for your celebrity existential crisis, Bong continued. You're one of Hollywood's most successful actors. You have more money than you can spend, and you're crying because your private little plane is going through a storm. It's not just a storm, Ford protested. This is supernatural. The instruments are going crazy, the radio doesn't work. Now we're getting to the point, Bong said, a smile appearing on his lips again. You finally realized this isn't normal. You knew all along? Ford, I've been dead for almost 80 years, sitting in the co-pilot seat of a private jet in 2024, giving flight advice to Han Solo. Of course I knew this wasn't normal. Ford couldn't help but smile despite the desperate situation. Okay, point to you, he admitted. So what's really happening? Bong leaned back in his seat and looked out the window at the storm surrounding them. Lightning continued to flash around them, but now Ford noticed there was a pattern to them, almost as if they were signals. Sometimes, Bong said thoughtfully, when a pilot is in real danger, when there really is no way out, the sky opens up. Not physically, but in other ways. Other ways. Have you ever heard of the ghost aviators of World War II? Bong asked. Pilots who reported seeing formations of old fighters flying alongside them during storms, voices on the radio from dead pilots offering guidance? Ford shook his head. Of course not. They don't talk about it because they think no one will believe them. But it happens more than you imagine. And you are? I'm what happens when a pilot dies doing what he loves more than anything in the world, Bong explained. The passion for flight doesn't die with the body. It continues, looking for ways to express itself, to help. This is insane, Ford muttered. More insane than doing your own stunts at 82, Bong retorted. More insane than piloting planes after nearly dying in an accident less than 10 years ago? Ford had no answer for that. Look, Ford, Bong continued, his voice becoming more serious. You can keep philosophizing about the nature of life after death, or you can focus on staying alive. Your choice. Okay, Ford said, breathing deeply. What do I need to do? First thing, stop trusting the instruments. They're responding to the storm's electromagnetic forces, not physical reality. How will I navigate without instruments? The same way pilots navigated for thousands of years before electronic instruments, Bong replied. Body sensations, visual observation, intuition. That's impossible in this storm. I can't see anything but clouds and lightning. But you can, Bong insisted. You just don't know how to look yet. He pointed forward, through the cracked windshield. See that sequence of lightning? They're not random. They're following a pattern, showing the air currents. Ford looked intently, trying to see what Bong was describing. Lightning is attracted to the most charged air masses, Bong explained. If you follow their direction, you'll find the most stable currents. Gradually, Ford began to perceive the pattern. The lightning really wasn't random. There was a structure to them, as if they were mapping invisible paths through the storm. Now, Bong said, feel the aircraft. Stop trying to control it and start listening to it. Listen. Every plane talks to its pilot if you know how to hear. The sound of the engines, the vibration of the fuselage, the pressure on the controls, all of this is telling you something. Ford closed his eyes and tried to concentrate. Gradually, he began to distinguish different types of vibration. Some came from common turbulence, others from crosswinds, still others from something different. There's something pulling the plane to the left, he said. Correct, Bong confirmed. A massive downdraft. If you try to fight it, you'll be sucked down. But if you go around it, I can use its energy to gain speed, Ford completed, beginning to understand. Now you're starting to think like a real pilot, Bong said approvingly. Ford began to maneuver the aircraft with more confidence, following Bong's guidance and his own growing perceptions about the storm's patterns. Tell me about the P-38, Ford said while navigating through a particularly intense zone of turbulence. Why did you prefer it to the Mustang? Ah, the Lightning, Bong said, his eyes shining with nostalgia. It was a magnificent machine. 2 engines, so if one failed, you still had the other. Incredible speed, heavy armament, 450 caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose. He gestured enthusiastically while speaking, clearly in his element. But what I really loved about it was the versatility. It could be a fighter, bomber, reconnaissance, anything the mission required, like a versatile actor, he added, with an ironic smile. You're comparing fighter planes to actors? Ford asked, a note of humor appearing in his voice for the first time since the crisis began. Why not? Both need versatility, perfect timing, and the ability to improvise when things don't go according to plan. Ford laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised him. I never thought of it that way. You know what my most difficult mission was? Bong asked, adjusting his position in the seat. November 1944, over Ormoc Bay in the Philippines. I was leading a formation of 8 P-38s when we were ambushed by 24 Zeros. How did you survive? Some didn't survive, Bong said grimly. We lost 3 planes that day. But those of us who survived learned something important. Sometimes the only way to win an impossible situation is to accept that it's impossible and act accordingly. That doesn't make sense. It does. When you accept that you're in an impossible situation, you stop trying to apply normal rules. You start to improvise, use instinct, do things you would normally never try. Ford reflected on this while guiding the plane through a zone of intense crosswinds. It's like the first time I played Han Solo, he said slowly. George Lucas wanted a specific type of hero, but I knew that wasn't it. So I stopped trying to be what he wanted and started being what the character needed to be. Exactly, Bong nodded. You improvised, created something new instead of following the script to the letter. And it worked. It worked because you stopped fighting against your own nature and started working with it. Ford looked at Bong with new understanding. That's what you're teaching me, isn't it? To stop fighting the storm and start working with it. Now you get it, Bong smiled. And it only took 40 minutes of total hysteria. Hey, Ford protested with a smile. I was afraid of dying. Every pilot is afraid of dying, Bong replied. The difference between a living pilot and a dead pilot is what they do with that fear. What did you do? I used fear as fuel. Fear sharpens reflexes, increases concentration, makes you pay attention to details you would normally ignore. As if to demonstrate Bong's point, he pointed to a specific section of the radar screen. See that cloud formation there? It looks solid, but there's an opening on the right side. If you make a gentle 15-degree turn to the right, Ford followed the guidance and immediately felt the aircraft stabilize. The turbulence decreased dramatically, and for the first time in almost an hour he could see a patch of blue sky through the clouds. Incredible, he murmured. How can you see these things? Experience. And the fact that being dead gives me a slightly different perspective, Bong added dryly. Ford laughed again. You have a very peculiar sense of humor for someone who died 80 years ago. Sense of humor is one of the few things that survive death, Bong replied. Especially for military pilots. If we couldn't laugh at death, we'd go insane. Tell me about the day you died, Ford suddenly asked. Bong was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focusing on something distant. August 6, 1945, he said finally. I was testing the P-80 Shooting Star in Burbank, first-generation American jet fighter. What happened? Engine failure during takeoff. In normal situations, I would try to return to the airport, but the P-80 was an experimental plane. I didn't know its flight characteristics well. Bong paused, reliving the moment. I had 2 options. Try a turn to return to the airport, risking losing control and crashing over a residential area, or continue straight ahead and try a forced landing in an open area. Bong looked out the window at the lightning that continued to illuminate the clouds around them. I chose to continue straight ahead. I always chose to protect civilians, even if it meant greater personal risk. That's how we had been trained. And then, I found an open field about 2 miles from the airport. I almost made it. The P-80 touched the ground, rolled for about 300 meters, then exploded. Ford swallowed hard. Did you feel pain? No, it was instantaneous. One thing I was piloting, the next, I was watching the wreckage from above. Bong smiled melancholically. It was strange. My first reaction was irritation at having lost the plane. It cost American taxpayers a fortune. That's your regret? Losing an experimental plane? No, Bong shook his head. My regret is not having had time to pass on everything I learned. 40 kills, hundreds of missions, years of combat experience, all lost in a second. He looked directly at Ford. That's why I'm here. To pass on what I can when I can. Ford felt an emotional weight in these words. How many times have you done this? Appeared to help pilots in danger. A few times, not many. It needs to be a very specific situation. Experienced pilot, real danger, and... He hesitated. And what? And someone who truly values life enough to fight for it, but is temporarily lost. Ford looked at him intently. Why me? Because you almost gave up flying after the 2015 accident, but didn't give up completely. Because you keep challenging age, kept pursuing dangerous passions when most people your age are playing golf. Because you still have fire inside you. The aircraft passed through a zone of calmer air, and Ford was able to relax slightly on the controls. You know what's funny? Ford said. I spend my whole life playing courageous heroes, but when I'm really in danger, I become a hysterical wreck. That's not funny, it's human, Bong corrected. Real courage isn't absence of fear, it's action despite fear. Did you feel fear during combat? Every single day, especially after seeing friends get shot down. Every takeoff was an internal struggle between duty and self-preservation instinct. Bong adjusted his position in the seat, his military uniform impeccable despite being in an aircraft shaken by supernatural storm. Want to know a secret? My first combat mission, I vomited in the P-38 before takeoff. Pure fear. But I took off anyway. What changed? I realized that fear was information, not paralysis. Fear told me where to pay attention, kept me alert, forced me to be better. As if conjured by Bong's words, a particularly violent gust of wind hit the aircraft. Ford instinctively tensed on the controls, but this time didn't panic. Instead, he felt the aircraft's movement and compensated smoothly. Much better, Bong nodded approvingly. Now you're piloting instead of just reacting. I still don't know where we are, Ford observed, checking the useless instruments again. Ah, but I do, Bong said casually. We're approximately 40 nautical miles southwest of Santa Barbara, flying north-northwest at a speed of about 220 knots. Ford looked at him incredulously. How can you know that? We don't have functioning navigation instruments. Celestial navigation, wind patterns, elapsed time, estimated speed, the same techniques we used in the Pacific when radio was compromised by the enemy. But it's cloudy. We can't see stars or sun. You don't need to see directly. Cloud behavior, prevailing wind direction, even air temperature, all of this gives information about position and direction. Bong pointed to a specific section of the clouds. See how the clouds are forming there? That indicates proximity to mountains, probably California's coastal range. Ford looked intently, trying to see what Bong described. And the color of light through the clouds? Slightly more yellowish than it should be. That suggests reflection from urban lights, probably Los Angeles to the south. This is incredible, Ford admitted. Where did you learn these techniques? Necessity. In the Pacific Theater, we often flew missions of more than 8 hours over open ocean. GPS didn't exist, and radio frequently failed or was compromised by the Japanese. How didn't you get lost? Some did get lost, Bong said grimly. We had a term, fly until you run out of fuel. It happened to many good pilots. He was silent for a moment, clearly remembering lost companions. That's why we learned to read the sky like a book. Every cloud, every wind change, every temperature variation was a chapter in the story of where we were and where we were going. Teach me, Ford asked. First lesson, stop relying only on instruments. They're tools, not substitutes for perception and judgment. Ford nodded, forcing himself to ignore the crazed indicators and focus on what he felt directly. Second lesson, every air mass has personality. This storm, for example, it seems violent and chaotic, but it has structure. Patterns that can be read and used. How so? The most violent gusts come at regular intervals, approximately every 45 seconds. If you time it, you can anticipate and compensate. Ford paid attention and realized Bong was right. There was a rhythm to the turbulence, almost like giant breathing. Third lesson, and the most important, trust your instincts. You have more than 40 years of flight experience. Your body knows things your conscious mind doesn't perceive. What kind of things? Subtle changes in air pressure, variations in engine sound, small alterations in aircraft behavior. Your primitive brain processes this information automatically. Ford closed his eyes for a moment, trying to feel the aircraft and the environment around it. "There's an updraft to our right," he said suddenly. "Correct." "How did you know?" "The plane is tilting slightly to the right and the wind sound changed pitch." "Excellent. Now use that current." Ford adjusted course slightly and immediately felt the aircraft being lifted smoothly by the ascending air mass. "It's like surfing," he observed. "Exactly. You're surfing the invisible waves of air." For a few minutes they flew in relative comfort, Ford practicing the techniques Bong taught. "Can I ask a personal question?" Ford said finally. "Sure. Do you miss being alive?" Bong contemplated the question for a long time. "I miss some things. The smell of aviation fuel in the morning, the sensation of G-force during tight turns, the camaraderie with other pilots." He paused. "But mainly I miss the possibilities. The flights I never took, the places I never visited, the people I never met." "Were you ever married?" "I was engaged. Marge Vattendahl. We were going to marry when I returned from the war." Bong's voice became softer. "She waited for me during the entire war, 4 years, and then 3 weeks before the wedding—" "I'm sorry." "She married 2 years later, to a good man, a dentist from Milwaukee. They had 4 children, were happy for 57 years until he died." "How do you know this?" Bong smiled sadly. "One of the advantages of being dead is being able to follow the people you loved. She died in 2003, at 81, surrounded by family." "Did you see her when she died?" "I did, and she saw me too. For a moment we were young again." She smiled and said, "You're late for our date, Dick Bong." Ford felt tears in his eyes. "Did you stay together?" "For a while, but she had a new journey to begin, and I had pilots to help." The storm around them began to show signs of weakening. Lightning was less frequent, and Ford could occasionally glimpse patches of clearer sky. "We're getting out of it," he observed. "We are, but it's not over yet. The most dangerous part of any flight isn't the storm, it's the landing." "Why?" "Because during the storm you're totally alert, adrenaline high, all senses sharpened. But when you see solid ground, you start to relax, and that's when accidents happen." As if to prove Bong's point, Ford saw lights through the clouds, the familiar lights of Los Angeles spreading to the horizon. "We're almost home," he said with relief. "Not yet," Bong warned. "First we need to figure out exactly where we are, assess remaining fuel, and find the nearest suitable airport for landing." Ford checked the fuel indicator and felt his stomach tighten. "We're low on fuel." "How low?" "Maybe 20 minutes of flight." "Then we have no margin for error. Where's the nearest airport?" Ford thought quickly. "Burbank is about 15 minutes if we're where you said we are." "Burbank is a good option. Long runway, emergency equipment, and—" Bong hesitated. "And what?" "It's where I died. There's poetic symmetry in that." Before Ford could respond, the radio crackled back to life. "November 777 Hotel, Foxtrot, Burbank Tower. You're on radar. What's your situation?" Ford grabbed the microphone with trembling hands. "Burbank Tower, Hotel Foxtrot. Fuel emergency, instruments compromised, requesting priority for landing. Hotel Foxtrot, priority approved. Proceed directly to runway 08, wind calm, visibility 10 miles. Emergency equipment is being activated." "Copy, Burbank." Ford looked at Bong. "How did they suddenly find us?" "Because we're no longer between dimensions," Bong explained. "We're back in the normal world." "That means that my work here is almost finished." Ford felt a pang of sadness. In the last 2 hours, Bong had become more than a savior. He had become a friend. "I don't want you to go," Ford admitted. "I know, and that's exactly why I need to go." "I don't understand." "If I stayed, you would never learn to trust yourself completely. You would always be waiting for external help." Ford flew toward the lights of Burbank Airport, which he could now see clearly through the cracked windshield. "Hotel Foxtrot, Burbank Tower. You're 5 miles from the runway. Continue approach." "Burbank, I'll need medical assistance after landing. It's a long story." "Copy. Hotel Foxtrot. Ambulance is on standby." Ford looked at Bong. "They'll think I'm crazy when I tell them about you." "Don't tell," Bong suggested. "Let it be our secret. But people need to know you're still helping pilots. The right people will know when it's the right time." The Burbank runway appeared ahead, brilliantly illuminated against the darkness of night. Ford had never seen anything so beautiful. "Hotel Foxtrot, final for runway 08. Wind calm, cleared to land." "Cleared to land, 08." Ford aligned the aircraft with the runway, but his hands were shaking again, this time from emotional exhaustion. "You can do this," Bong said calmly. "It's just another landing." "It doesn't feel like just another landing. The best landings never feel routine. Use the tension, let it sharpen your concentration." Ford breathed deeply and focused on the approaching runway. The Citation was responding perfectly now, as if there had never been problems with the controls. 50 feet, Bong announced, his voice firm and professional. 40, 30, cut power. Now. Ford cut the throttles and felt the main wheels touch the asphalt with a small bump. The aircraft rolled smoothly down the runway while he applied brakes gradually. "Hotel Foxtrot, welcome back. Taxi to General Ramp, follow the emergency vehicle." "Thank you, Burbank, thank you very much." Ford taxied slowly to the ramp, following the emergency vehicle lights. When he finally stopped and cut the engines, the silence was deafening after hours of wind roar and thunder. "You made it," Bong said softly. Ford turned to thank him, but the co-pilot's seat was empty. For a moment, Ford thought he had imagined everything, but then he saw something on the seat, a small metal insignia, a pair of U.S. Army Air Force's pilot wings, vintage World War II. He picked up the insignia, which was warm to the touch, and read the inscription on the back. Margie Richard D. Bong, 40 victories, fly high, fly far. The aircraft door opened, and paramedics rushed in. "Mr. Ford, are you injured?" Ford looked at them, still holding the insignia. "No, I'm fine. Perfectly fine. Sir, we received reports that you were in severe emergency. Instruments failing, radio dead for more than 2 hours." 2 hours? Ford looked at his watch. It was almost midnight. He had taken off from Santa Monica at 4 in the afternoon. "I flew for 8 hours? Sir, your flight plan showed arrival in Jackson Hole at 7 p.m. When you didn't make contact, we initiated search and rescue. We couldn't locate your aircraft for almost 6 hours. Ford shook his head, confused. There was a storm." "Sir, there were no storms reported anywhere in California today. Flight conditions have been perfect all day." One of the paramedics approached with a medical flashlight. "Mr. Ford, I'm going to examine your pupils. You may have suffered hypoxia or spatial disorientation." "I'm fine," Ford insisted, but allowed the examination. "Normal pupils, normal breathing, pulse slightly elevated but within normal range," the paramedic reported. "Mr. Ford, what happened up there?" Ford looked again at the insignia in his hand, then at the paramedic. "I learned that we're never really alone," he said finally, "and that sometimes, when we need it most, help comes from places we would never expect." The paramedic frowned. "Sir, are you sure you feel well? Maybe we should take you to the hospital for observation." "Not necessary," Ford said, getting out of the aircraft. "I've never felt better in my life." As he walked toward the terminal, Ford looked at the clear, starry night sky. There wasn't a cloud in sight. "Thank you, Dick," he whispered to the stars. For a moment, he was sure he heard a familiar laugh carried by the night wind. A week later, Ford was in his home office researching Richard Ira Bong on the internet. Every detail the ghost pilot had mentioned proved accurate. Birth date, place of origin, number of kills, date, and circumstances of death. There were even photographs. And when Ford saw the first photo of Bong in pilot uniform, his heart stopped. It was exactly the man who had been in the co-pilot's seat. He continued reading and found a detail that made him smile. According to historical records, Richard Bong had died testing a P-80 Shooting Star at Burbank Airport on August 6, 1945, exactly the same airport where Ford had landed a week before. Ford picked up the insignia, which he kept on his desk since that night. He had it evaluated by a military antiques expert. It was genuine, dated 1945, and according to records, had been buried with Major Bong. "Impossible," he murmured, but couldn't stop smiling. That night, Ford flew again, a local flight over Los Angeles just to test his new navigation skills. There were no storms, no supernatural visitors, but for the first time in years, Ford felt completely connected to his aircraft, reading every signal, every wind change, every vibration. He was flying not just with instruments, but with instinct, intuition, and decades of accumulated experience. He was flying like a true pilot. And somewhere above the twinkling lights of Los Angeles, Ford could swear he felt the presence of all the great pilots who came before: Lindbergh, Earhart, Yeager, and yes, Dick Bong. All of them still flying, in one way or another, in the skills they passed on, in the passion they inspired, in the lives they saved. Some connections, Ford realized, are truly eternal. And sometimes when a pilot is truly in danger and truly worth saving, the sky opens up, not physically, but in ways that transcend common understanding. Ford landed in Santa Monica that night with a feeling of completeness he hadn't experienced in years. He knew there would always be more storms, more challenges, more moments of fear and uncertainty. But he also knew he would never really be alone in the skies again. And as for Dick Bong's insignia, Ford kept it with him during all subsequent flights, not as a lucky charm, but as a reminder that true courage isn't absence of fear, it's action despite fear, and that sometimes, just sometimes, real heroes appear when we least expect and most need them. And you, dear listener, have you ever been through a situation where you felt you weren't alone even when completely isolated? Have you ever had the sensation of receiving help from a source you couldn't explain? Leave in the comments your own experience with unexplainable connections in moments of crisis. If this story touched your heart and made you believe that we're never truly alone in our most difficult battles, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to not miss any of our stories about impossible encounters that change lives forever. Share with someone who needs to know that in moments of greatest danger, when all equipment fails and all hope seems lost, there are still heroes flying in the heights, ready to guide us back home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the skies of the impossible. Keep flying high and never stop believing that true heroes never really die. They just find new ways to save us.